In 85, you had the whole of Fort Portal belonging to another government. Fred Muhumza, you see me here, I left school in July 1985. I was in senior 3. By the time the school opened, I was in another regime, so I could not go back to school. Until mid-1986, now I'm in senior 4. So I never did promotion exams to senior 4. But now I had 6 months, 4 months literally, to sit for my A level, but also to complete senior 3. And while I tried to do that, there was another insurgency and disruption, and the school was closed for 3 other months. So I came back a month to UNEB. Now, those were serious disruptions of an economic and social nature. But here we are. So those were the declines that the civil war and the military coup of July 27th July 1985, the economy had literally declined significantly by the time Mr. Museveni comes in. So 86, when he came in, we want to assess the transition, and we've agreed with the team that we'll have 6 guiding questions. 1, what was resolved and has not reemerged since 1986? What did we solve? The second question that is going to guide us is what was resolved but has come back. The third question is what was never resolved. In other words, it has persisted throughout the 40 years. We still have it. The fourth question, what is emerging? It wasn't there. Now Trump is in the house. Wars are in the house. Ukraine has been invaded. What has emerged that was not there? Number 5 is what was not done, possibly due to foresight, or we did not prioritize it. And the final question is what should we do to sustain the modernization of the economy? To answer those questions, we get back and look into what is Museveni's ideological underpinning. 1 is rationality, evidence-based decision making. And as I've said, when the evidence is not on the table, but he still has to make a decision, he will make a decision. Now, to resolve that challenge of possibly a decision that was not informed by evidence, but it had to be made, Professor Mutebile, rest in peace, created an institution called the Economic Policy Research Center. And some of us have merged through there. What was the tagline? Policy-oriented research. Don't go to research how many pins angels dance on a pin. I have policy issues. So the Economic Policy Research Center, I'm talking about institutions and discussions for raising evidence, was about to say, what decision did you make? Did we give you the information? If we didn't, we are going to research and bring it. So please have time to review. And for that purpose, the chairperson of the Economic Policy Research Center is the PSST himself. He determines what should be done there. And was a project of the Ministry of Finance, still remains a project of the Ministry of Finance. Some of us worked there diligently for years until when I was told, you are staying too far away in Makerere, the problems are right in the Ministry of Finance. So they brought me in there as an advisor to permanently sit in the Ministry of Finance, but as an ambassador. I was not a staff. I remained a staff of EPRC, but on secondment. And what a glorious 8 years they were to learn from the decision makers. But the whole point is evidence, decision making, because Museveni is rational. Museveni is also reasonable. Whenever you would come back and say, we think, Your Excellency, the decision you took, based on the evidence now, was not the right one. Or it was right, but we have a better option. Commander-in-Chief, you give him options. You don't say, jump from A to B. You say there was A, we have evaluated it, but we have these other options. So Museveni is reasonable. Many times I hear people say orders from above. I have been in that space. I know you can receive an order from above. Say, sir, I have heard you. Give us 2 weeks, we will be back. And if you're back in 2 weeks with options, the story changes. And that is how it has been. That is one of the things that we would want to be. So Museveni is reasonable. When you provide the context, he's able to listen. Realism, what is the reality on the ground? I think these are traits he also picked as a military man, because you don't just go through a swamp or go to attack when you do not have sufficient men. We know the guerrilla warfare, sometimes you attack not to keep the territory. You only attack to disrupt, show the enemy I'm here, carry away their weapons and leave this territory. Later on, he began to occupy and retain territories. But in the early stages, it was attack, do whatever you want to do and leave. So that is being realistic. Then he's also adaptable, as I've said, flexibility in implementation of issues, logic must be followed, and then creativity. Those are key attributes, and then innovation of Mr. Museveni as he ran through. So as we move into the space, it's worth noting, as I've said, regimes do not consciously come out to destroy whatever is happening. The size of the economy, as we've said, had shrunk. Some people say by the time Museveni came in, GDP was 1.26 billion. Others say it was 3.6, but we can forgive ourselves. The data at that point was not clear. But all we know, it was very small. That's the conclusion from this. 60% of households had retreated into subsistence. Salt was a preserve of the rich. One time during the Amin era, my father turned up with a 60-kilogram bag of sugar. And I'm like, what has happened? But being a district education officer, maybe they came and gave the district officials. But he had to keep it by his bedside, because being small boys who had never seen sugar, we found how to make holes and keep licking it until mommy finds some sugar on your lips and you know what you are headed for. But those were days of scarcity. And how do you deal with those? That is what Museveni inherited, hyperinflation. The transport network had collapsed. And I remember a case when I had to come from Bushenyi to Kampala on a truck loaded with coffee. We spent 2 days to reach Kampala. That was the economy that was inherited. So while you want to stabilize the security, you also want to restore the infrastructure. And there were others manufacturing, literally many of them had closed down, or they were operating at very low capacity. Quite a number of them were below 5%. We still have factories, as I said, what has persisted, that are operating at 30% and below. And in Kayip, we also have factories that are not working. The value addition equipment like haulers, like coolers for milk, that are literally not working. So some things have persisted, and we need to look into how do we resolve that. External debt, now we have also added domestic debt. If you look at the Charter for Fiscal Responsibilities by the Ministry of Finance, debt service interest payment is not supposed to go beyond 12% of our domestic revenues. The report of Parliament that approved the budget for 2025-26 indicates that is at 25%. Now, that costs you money that you should have put in services. So we need to answer the debt question. So guided by the 10-point program the President went through, and that were the 10 points, I just highlighted the critical 4 for purposes of this presentation. One was restoration of democracy and security, elimination of corruption and misuse of power, pursuit of mixed economy strategy, and then building an independent, integrated, self-sustaining national economy. As we've said, ideologically, Museveni was ready to switch from one side to another to make sure you find what works. But what works needed to be informed by candid discussions and not just hearsay. So his move to the right, you literally have about $25 million as reserves in the central bank, supporting only 2 weeks of imports. Professor Surma here will testify the dilemma you have. When you want to import drugs, you want to import fuel, you want to import bullets, you want to bring in food, what do? And the only donor willing to give you that money is saying, do the following. We call those DPI, Development Policy Loans, DPLs. The loan is based on you reforming your development policies. But you are also in need, and they are in need. So for that time, you found programs like Essential Drugs Program. We know there are people with diabetes, there are people with cancer, but at this point, we don't have money for everybody. Can we find an Essential Drugs Program? That is realism, that is rationalism, that's logical. Because we know non-communicable diseases can be very expensive to treat. But thank God, 40 years down the road, we now have some options. Even if they are not in Mulago, they are available in the market, you can find them. That is part of the journey that we need to recognize. Because the dilemmas of Mulago, ladies and gentlemen, are not by Mulago itself. They are bigger ecosystem, because if almost 50% of your budget is being taken by debt, what is left to do roads? What is left to do education? What is left to do health? What is left to do security? We are back to those levels where the budgets may be bigger, but the needs are even bigger, and we're back to those levels of rationalizing budgets by priorities. And Honorable Mouse, people are saying pay us even in retirement. So what do? We want these days will end up paying more judges in retirement than the ones in practice. So we are proposing to follow those judges in retirement. So can you still read and write a ruling for us, since we are paying you? But that's another conversation. But it's part of the evidence we need to put on the table, because some things we can't change, but there is room for leveraging. So there was economic recovery program. Most people remember 2 zeros were cut off and 30% was taken. But what was the gist? What was the economic policy principle that was being followed in those aspects? You had inflation, you wanted to change the currency, you wanted to raise some revenue as well to support the same people. There was a coffee stabilization tax. We all remember 1994. Many people may not remember that. But because of the spike in the coffee prices, there was an introduction of coffee stabilization, mainly to protect the households themselves, who are now going to have surplus and they would spend it on things that are not useful to them, being informed by the permanent income hypothesis that I don't want to get into. But also government realized if somebody has been getting $1-2 on coffee, now the price of coffee is $5. Why don't I take 1.5 and he gets 3.5? We share the windfall. So that policy enabled government to realize some revenue, because at that point the revenue to GDP was less than 4%. And we needed money to do the roads, which were also helping the coffee to go through. These were really the principles that informed some of these decisions. Like them or hate them, there was an economic logic to these aspects. But also wanted to curb inflation. If farmers were going to get all that money, they were going to cause inflation because of increased money supply. So inflation was being curbed from various options. Today, we seem to have only interest rates, which may not be the right way to go, because it kills off further investment. We've got to do those trade-offs. But we knew that these reforms had gainers and losers, and for that, the responsive Museveni logically said, can we set up a PAPSCA? How many remember PAPSCA? So we knew there were people who are going to be affected by programs of social alleviation, and they needed support. That is the responsive and reactive Museveni that we saw. Now, maybe there are people suffering today, and I see them every other day. Which academic has come up to say this is how we can support the borders and the women on the streets who are facing hardships? If we took that paper, wouldn't we get some policy proposals? At the Makerere University Business Economic Forum, we are doing a study on borders. Some of you hate them. You dare remove borders from Kampala, the city will collapse. Because some of you, they are the ones who take your children. They are the ones you call to take the bunch of banana home. You don't even know where the school of that child is, but somebody picks the child and takes them back. And for that, you concentrate on your desk. Because not all of us are privileged like a deputy governor to have a driver and a car. But your child needs to be picked. But I'm going to be meeting until 9 p.m. So what happens? You call a border. You have dogs at home, they need meat, they just call you at 7, the meat is finished. You call a butcher, the meat is delivered. So borders are not just a nuisance. They are part and parcel of the Kampala system. The study is about market resilience, built by the American model of how flexible and resilient are livelihoods. Each one of us, our livelihoods are part and parcel of that. You can now order CJ, and Museveni literally allowed us to learn from COVID, when some of these logistical networks were allowed to continue moving on. So responsiveness created PAPSCA. There were policies for expenditure reduction. How do we reduce government spending? Retrenchment, civil service was scaled down. Demobilization of the soldiers. Mr. Museveni was convinced, now you have finished the war, some of these soldiers can go home. And the money was provided to reintegrate them into society. Now, there are different records. How many were sent home? But I think I've seen one of the president's letters indicating 60,000 soldiers were sent home. And the convincing fact was, Mr. President, when we send off these peasants who you trained to fight, we will save enough money and invest in education. Now, in the future, when you want to recruit, you will be able to find senior 4 graduates. Those are better in the army than these peasants you are having today. So it was a win-win. And indeed, you can see the military we have, some of them are some of the best educated individuals. So some of these programs were futuristic, but you had to bring the evidence. I'm laying off this, what is my benefit? So I raised 3, or rather 9 things that Mr. Museveni put in his remarks at Igongo. I will quickly run them through, because he said, this is what I set out to do in 1986. Number 1, restore security of persons and property. And with security, you will quarrel with Mr. Museveni if you don't speak the right thing, because that is his core. Security of person and security of property. We know some things have persisted. Security of property, the land grabbing is really a threat to property of individuals. I have my life, but somebody has grabbed my land. Now my life also is endangered because my livelihood is distorted. Now some people are losing their property because of economic policies, bank foreclosures, that the economy is not able to guarantee and secure personal property. So while security is there, my personal property going away, then I have a vulnerability that needs to be addressed by government. These are things that have persisted. A friend of mine told me on Sunday, the priest emphasized many things but said, twafuna emirembe naye kati emirembe gitumazeeko emirembe. Now translate for your neighbor if they have not understood, especially if they have not laughed, then that means they have not understood. It's possible. Fine, I'm alive, but my land has been taken. I'm alive, but diseases are taking me. How do I secure my personal life property as well? These are things that have persisted over the 40 years. So in practice, rationality and the use of evidence in decision making should not compromise or be compromised by emotional and political choices. But we know the choice makers are politicians and they have goals. So you need to listen to them. What is it that they want to meet politically, and how do we meet each other halfway? Do we create other elements of PAPSCA as the policies move on? So the restoration, the demobilization was able to inform and save some monies which went into the social sector. To give money to Mulago, something else must go away. Again, I learned from Professor Mutebire about what we call counter-cyclical policies. If something is going up, something else must go down. So if the security budget must increase, some other budget must go down. If you want to increase funding to social services, you need to cut somewhere. And we have a bloated civil service. We need to reduce the civil service. There is a proposal. Genuinely, we want to increase the salaries for civil servants. And it happened in the 80s. They were increased by a very good percentage. But you don't increase before you scale down the numbers. If something is going up, another thing must go down. Can we do an Elon Musk email to each of the civil servants to give us 5 bullets of what you do in office? Anybody who fails to raise 5 bullets of what they do, they don't know what they are doing. So why are we paying them? As they have said, if you pretend to pay, people will pretend to work. But what do you do? And that can be a challenge. So we need to first of all reform and restructure the civil service and then increase the pay. The savings from those who go home, we shall have a PAPSCA for them. We shall have a recovery strategy for them. But the economy cannot move with the current spending going by the borrowing levels. Number 2 was liberalization and privatization, which was intended to create space for investors. In the private sector, remember they had the ideology, they had the greed like Adam Smith made to make more money. They were not like employees of government who were happy with their salary, while the companies were not doing any production. So liberalization had those aspects of creating a space for actors who would bring in money, bring in new ideas, but also competition drives you to move to the next level. I won't be mentioning the other day I ordered for food and paid for it, but because it's a monopoly setting, the kind of service I received was the worst. What if there was competition? You would get better. I'm sure Mestil here is making sure we are all comfortable, because if we are not, we will choose another place from Musevenomics 2026. But they want to say, can you make a partnership here? Can you stay with us? You are eating, are you okay? But there are people you come and sit and they are not bothered whether you are there. It's as if a cockroach has come into the restaurant. Liberalization was to sort out some of these. And as we will see, the liberalization of the coffee sector, it did not remove the cooperatives. They were supposed to compete. And some of the first entities to register in that space were actually cooperatives. And they have persisted with all the struggles. So it's not that it was intended to kill the cooperative culture, it was intended to bring in the culture. Ladies and gentlemen, coffee is a cash-based product. For you to carry away my bag, I need my money now. How do you finance that coffee? And by straight line calculation, that is 12 billion every day going to the farming households. If you calculate how much kiboko is produced in a year, divide it by 365, it's 12 billion every day that goes to the households. Where is that money coming from? You want to be looking into those considerations. So the privatization, as we've said, one, to bring in the private sector, but also to cut the hemorrhage on the government budget. Number 3, diversification of the economy, with a special focus on increasing export revenues. We have information Uganda's export revenues at the time, 95% was coming from coffee. So there was a program of non-traditional exports. Honorable Victoria is here. It was largely sitting in her docket as Minister of Agriculture. How do we export fish, flowers, beans, maize? And who badly needed the dollars? Bank of Uganda. So it was not a preserve of the Minister of Agriculture. There was an agricultural policy secretariat inside Bank of Uganda to provide technical guidance on what should the dollar rate be, what should the interest rate be. Today I hear some of these things are different. I'm looking forward when we have a policy secretariat in Bank of Uganda, not a credit facility. So Bank of Uganda should not be running credit. That is not your space. You run policy, you have banks you are regulating, let them run the credit. So what is it doing there? These are ideas that when you liberalize, put institutions in place, let's monitor them, let's evaluate them. Number 4, and so this program of increasing the non-traditional exports, we saw quite a lot of thrust coming through from that space. The fishing factories around Lake Victoria employed 38,000 people by around 2020 in the 20s and created quite enough money for us. Coffee liberalization has taken us from 2.1 million bags in 1986 to now more than 8 million bags. Number 4 was the increase of access to markets, and Mr. Museveni has been working on that argument. How do we integrate and bring in other markets? But we're saying it's not about the East African market. We are all too poor. 400 million poor people don't make a market. You need to venture into those other markets. You need to venture into other value chains. And that's why the Chinese are quarreling with Americans, because they knew they had 1 billion people who were poor. So they ventured to tap the American and the European markets. So what is our strategy on export-led growth? We still have Kenya, South Sudan, and DRC as our biggest export destinations. How do we tap into these other bigger markets? But also, it's not value addition must be done in Uganda, and then we export finally refined and value-added products. Gone are the days for that. As I've said, one of the things that impressed me is a piston is just a small component, but a very vital component of a motor vehicle engine. The piston. That's where the power is. That's why the power is generated. So you don't want to get it wrong by the piston. Museveni's learnings from Adam Smith said you specialize. So here is a story that came out and woke up Trump to suspend. Evidence. Said I put tariffs on Mexico and Canada. People raised evidence and put it to him that, Mr. President, the powder of the aluminium that makes the piston begins in Tennessee. Just crushing the metal to make the powder is in Tennessee. Then the powder is turned into rods in Pennsylvania. You're still in the US. Once the rods are done, they are sent to Canada for polishing. And from Canada, they are sent to Mexico to be turned into pistons, which pistons are then sent to Michigan to be inserted into the engine. Trump said, I've suspended the sanctions, the tariffs, for another 90 days. I'm sure they are not coming back. But that's the nature of value addition. So how do we go about value addition agenda? I think there we still need to raise the evidence to have discussions with ourselves, building those institutions and making the decisions. China cut interest rates last week From what to what? 1.5 to 1.4. Can you imagine? Interest rates in China were too high at 1.5. What are they in Uganda? Can you compete? Do you think free land in Namanga will help you overcome the Chinese products? You're literally hemmed in. No political talk, no military solution will solve that. But the question is, how can Ugandans tap into global, cheap capital sources? Partnerships. And we need to have these conversations. We are not going to capitalize UDB and defeat the Chinese. So the policy options need to be thinking differently. As I've said, Museveni is adaptive, Museveni is realistic, Museveni is rational. Number 5, restoration of infrastructure. I've already mentioned the dilapidated state of roads. We have increased the tarmac roads to beyond 5,000 to 6,000. Now we have a problem of maintenance. They are breaking down and we can't find the money. These are things we are saying they are reemerging. They have not persisted, but they are reemerging. And these are adding to cost of doing business. So whether you have free land in an industrial park, this cost will cost you. The bank charge will cost you. And at the end of the day, you can't compete globally. And Bank of Uganda data on the real effective exchange rate indicates we have been gradually losing global competitiveness. So the policies we have need to be informed differently so that we can get back. The power sector, we are making it unsustainable. And as I've said, no politician sets out to make a decision to kill the economy. You have a genuine concern, you have listened to your manufacturers and you've said you will use electricity at 5 US cents. And they clap. I know they are. Am I back? sustain the energy sector. And it will come back on the government budget. And that will cost the manufacturer by way of money not going to the road. It will cause the manufacturer distortion of us borrowing from the banks and raising interest rates. So we need to have that comprehensive 360-degree assessment on how do you support the manufacturers in Uganda. And as I've said, part of their problem is lying global. Somebody in China is borrowing at 1.4. How do you resolve that competition? And China wisely sank $1.3 trillion in the Belt and Road Initiative to make sure their goods reach every corner of the world. So those are the dynamics. Those are the emerging issues. So we cannot set policies like we did 40 years ago. We need to rethink. We need to bring in the new realities that are on the table. Human capital development was essential. The liberalization of universities, education, has increased enrollment. Over 260,000 are now in universities. At the dawn of Mr. Museveni, it was less than 7,000 people in university. Because admission was determined by how many beds are in Makerere. Not even the lecture rooms or the lecturers. How many beds? And I remember that conversation. If somebody was in Makerere High, he's already on the fence of Makerere. He had a bed there. Can't he sleep there and come and study? That was the beginning of liberalization and privatization of higher level education. The evidence is with us. So some of these policies were very clearly marked to solve some problems. Number 7 is the leadership. And the president really highlights focused leadership is missing. The leaders have not informed the people. The leaders have not done the monitoring. So certain people have done their own things, especially at the technical level. And the examples amidst us, a few years back we said every district will get 1 billion for road construction. I like the Honorable Member of Parliament. I won't mention him. But he gave me his story. He went and asked, how are we spending the billion? The district officials had decided 400 million would be used on monitoring. That's 40%. Now, the remaining 60%, 30% was going to repair the grader. So only 30% was going to go to the roads. And at what cost? 45 million per kilometer. So they were literally going to do about 87 kilometers in a year. This is a very critical district full of production. So he asks them, you guys, what are you going to monitor? Can't we use the existing monitoring system that you already had so that we put this money in the roads? But also he inquired from other people and they told him, in this area of yours, a kilometer goes for 12 million, not 45. That's the leadership. But without that leadership, people are going to do their things and won't get the values. So it's a critical thing Mr. Museveni highlights for us, that the population, because this has not touched the population, they are jittery. And I want to quote from the letter I've seen from the Ministry of Defense and Veteran Affairs, which was warning of people who are taking advantage of the vulnerability of the youth. Now, I have been doing risk assessment and analysis. And one of the things we have been told, don't look for the man walking with matchsticks. Ask your question, how did the grass dry? Because if there is no dry grass, this man with a matchstick would not raise a problem. So while we must get the guy with the matchstick who is inciting the vulnerable youth, you want to go back, how did the youth get vulnerable? And you'll find that evidence in Museveni's paper of April 2020, where he talks about the real economy and the vulnerable economy. So some of our policies have left the vulnerability to persist, and it is translating into a security situation. And he ends with number 8, which is partly to explain why the vulnerability has persisted, and I read it among the 10-point program, fighting corruption. If we don't fight corruption, the vulnerability will increase, and this dry grass can even be lit by nobody but lightning. And it doesn't know the level of advancement. If you know what happened to California, you know what I'm talking about. It can take anybody. So we need to resolve some of this. As I've said, restructuring. Vietnam, as we speak, is retrenching 100,000 employees because they can't find the money and you can't compete with what you're supposed to do, and they just pay you salaries. Their precedents. Milei in Argentina has turned the country from a deficit of over 40 years into a surplus budget. They still have their debt, but at least now they can finance their budget on a day-to-day basis. Serious reforms, including withdrawal of subsidies. Nigeria, Lagos was full of traffic jams because of subsidized fuel. The current president simply says, no more subsidies. There were riots, they were handled, but alongside, the entire jam has disappeared. So what subsidies are we putting here that are not necessary? We are back to 1986. We need to look through and say, who are we subsidizing that cannot be sustained? So the conclusion is the Musevenomics agenda and the review of his policies and his practices really gives us some lessons to pick on. If we are to get inclusive development that will speak to the youth, we have some lessons that we can pick on. The Paris Development Model has come through. It is 7 pillars. I must emphasize this. It's not 1 pillar. It does not make sense to give somebody 1 million, they buy poultry or a goat, and there is no extension service provider in that village. And there is no functioning health facility in that village. I will sell the goat to treat my child. So when you come back, some of these genuinely will argue, will go to courts to write off. If you assess people and they really we failed them to succeed. The German economy is strong because you don't lend money and go and sit as a bank. You are part of that project. Before you foreclose, you've got to show what did you do to help the borrower succeed, you as a bank. Because this is the German economy. So you as a bank, you must participate in the German economy. That's why you make your profits. So the social market economy has made sure Germany is the strongest economy in Europe. It's not just because they are Germans. It's the policies the Germans have pursued. And I must say they were the first in 1948, the Minister of Finance in Germany used the terminology prosperity for all. The first time it was mentioned. And when they made vehicles, they made the smallest, the Beetle, so that they can make as many as possible. Prosperity for all. The Chinese we are seeing today, in 1960s, they did not have the bullet trains we are talking about. They had bicycles, and the bicycle was called China. It was the strongest. It was the most adored in Uganda. As a young boy, I wish I could have one. My father could not afford it. So I rode a hero. But this is where China has come from. Now I see people who want to be like China. You need to know that we are where China was in the 60s. I appreciate the standard gauge railway. But I'm more concerned, what are we going to take? I happened to be in the US one time with my friend and supervisor and boss, Professor Suruma. We were moving through the Silicon, Seattle, San Francisco area, and we were stopped by a train. For 45 minutes, the train was passing. Rails don't make money unless there is something moving on them. What was that rail track? Meter gauge. In the US, I've asked people, tell me where is a standard gauge railway section in the US. It's good to have them, but rationality, realism needs to come in. Ladies and gentlemen, Musevenomics is simply about that, and we can make the discussion. You have a right to give your opinion. That's why my paper is here with me, because I want to capture your opinions and include them in this paper. Mildred, tuhaiso Ruhang, come and take this over. If you don't know what tuhaise means, again, ask your neighbor. Professor Julius will not charge you for that. He's supposed to give that answer. Thank you for your kind attention.
I think Doctor deserves a bigger round of applause than that. Thank you very much for breaking it down. Almost 4 decades in less than 40 minutes. That was a very difficult task, but you handled it very, very diligently. And as Doctor did say, quite a lot that has happened over the time, but like he did say, it is an evolution. We are still discussing, and his paper is evolving, but very key amongst the issues that he did mention is the idea or the issue of evidence-based decision making. If you do not have the evidence, if you do not have the statistics that will be able to back your policy, that will be able to back the decision that you're taking, then it is as good as a bad decision to be able to take, or you're just thinking it out loud. But you also did mention one of the biggest issues or conversations that I and my colleagues in the media will always talk about, that is the issue of debt. I know if we are having any economic discussion, one of the conversations that will always come through is the issue of debt. And you highlighted as well the issue of domestic debt on the other hand. That while we are trying to ask people to work and join the money economy, if they get to supply government goods or services, are they able to receive the money so they can be able to plow it back? That's a very important discussion as well. And as we talk about import substitution and export promotion, Doctor did ask about what's the strategy on this export-led growth. So these are issues that we'll be pondering upon, and at a later stage we'll have a question and answer approach. But ladies and gentlemen, allow me invite our next speaker. I know that we are far behind schedule, but our next speaker is going to be speaking about a case study, which is an assessment of the major trends in Uganda's coffee sector. That cash crop which Doctor was talking about, because before you take that bag, there has to be some money that has to be given away. So what has been it about this coffee sector? And I'm privileged and honored to invite Professor Ezra Suruma to be able to take up this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give Professor Ezra Suruma a round of applause as he comes to take us on the session. Check, check. Check. Prof, I think you'll still use this. You'll still use this, but this is not working. Not yet. Not yet.
Thank you very much, Madam Taise.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Honorable ministers and former ministers, Excellencies the ambassadors, honorable members of parliament, religious leaders. I think protocol is a bit difficult, you forgive me. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. I'm privileged to have an opportunity to present a case study on coffee. This is an area where I was involved, so I'm speaking on the basis of what I learned, of course, during the Museveni era starting in 1986. But I will also look back before that so that we have a clear contrast before 1986 and after 1986, so we can see the contribution which has been made in the Museveni era. My interpretation of Musevenomics is what has happened to the economy since he came into government as leader vis-a-vis how the economy was before. So I'm not theoretical, I'm simply looking at the two sides. And the economic background, I'll begin with the economic background to coffee reforms. Professor, or is it, I don't know, Dr. Muhumza, thank you very much for your presentation. You have touched on inflation, runaway inflation. This sounds like it's just a word. But if you were there in 1970s and 80s, inflation was not just a word, it was totally disruptive experience. You buy something today at 10,000 shillings, and when you go tomorrow, it's 20,000. You say, but I bought it for 10,000 yesterday. You say, that was yesterday. Take it or leave it. So the inflation was very, very disruptive. Over 200%, some cases 300%. The shortages of commodities were very, very painful. There was nothing to buy. There was a lot of money. Everybody had money. Money was being carried in. We carried bags. You didn't carry money in your pocket because to not be enough to buy anything. So we carried money in bags. And as somebody said about Germany, then we came back with goods in our pockets. So the shortages of very basic things like salt and sugar and soap, this is what the situation was in 80s and 70s. Government control of prices, including foreign exchange, was the government set prices for soda, set prices for sugar, set prices for salt, set prices for everything. Of course, I don't know how to put it, you set prices for things which are not there. So what good does it do? And of course, anyone who had those things would make sure that they don't sell them openly on the market. You'd have to go in a side place and buy at a much higher price than what the government had said. So the effect of government controlled prices was to completely disrupt the economy. The coffee export was a monopoly, as Dr. Mumza indicated, and many of you know. It was an export monopoly of Coffee Marketing Board. It had been so for a very long time. And those who lived in the 70s and 80s know the coffee was being smuggled to Rwanda and Kenya because the Coffee Marketing Board not only was it not paying the farmers cash, but their prices were also fixed and unfavorable. Infrastructure breakdown, roads, power, no communications, telephones and so on. And then come in the structural adjustment program as an attempt to deal with all these problems that I have outlined briefly. The major economic reforms affecting the coffee sector. First was the liberalization of price controls, removing all controls on prices. This was dramatic. And then liberalization of foreign exchange. Some of you, when you go around with dollars and go to the bank and open a dollar bank account to withdraw dollars, you don't realize that before 1987, this would have been a crime. If you came in with the dollars at the airport, you had to fill an exchange control form and declare the dollars you had come in with and surrender those dollars to central bank within 48 hours. And the central bank would buy them at the official price when the market price was much higher than you would get from the central bank. This was very painful. Many of us who came in with foreign exchange, we would under-declare. You have $100 in your pocket, you declare that you have 20. But then if they take you aside and search you and find that you have more than 20, they take the 80 for themselves. So we were suffering. It was very painful whenever you came to the airport, having to decide to declare the foreign exchange. I visited many countries. I led a team. We visited many countries and came back and recommended the liberalization of foreign exchange, and the government adopted our recommendations, and I'm happy to say that that liberalization remains today. That was a fundamental change. Liberalization of coffee exports was difficult. Again, I led another team that visited many countries: Madagascar, Colombia, Costa Rica, and so on, to see how they were doing their coffee exporting. The World Bank and IMF put a lot of pressure on us. At first we resisted, but then the problem of crop finance became unbearable. Whenever it was time the coffee was in season, we had to come together with the commercial banks, with the central bank, with World Bank, and try and find out where to get money to give the Coffee Marketing Board to buy the coffee. This was called crop finance. And we couldn't find enough money. So, as you've had, because the Coffee Marketing Board was not paying farmers, they started cutting down coffee trees. Since this was the only export we had at that time, we became very deeply alarmed, and we had to do something to solve the problem. And one of the solutions was to see how we could change the mechanism for export. So in 1990, we wrote a paper and recommended liberalization, and this was done. It was done very quickly, and many Ugandans came into the coffee export sector. I remember over 100 people registering to become coffee exporters, but then they couldn't find money to buy the coffee either, and foreigners started dominating the sector as Ugandans started falling out because they couldn't access finance. In 1996, I was chairman managing. 1993 to 96, I was chairman managing director of Uganda Commercial Bank. So I asked the president to allow me to use money from privatization to help our exporters, and he allowed me. So I took $100 million and started lending to our exporters at a lower interest rate, attempting to compete with the foreign companies. But when I left 1996, I left the bank, I'm not sure what happened. So I did a comparative when I was at Brookings in 2010. I attempted an analysis of coffee exportation. Thank you. I didn't know that the slides were being shown. So, from 1964 to 2024, I did attempted to see how I was really interested to know how the liberalization of coffee exporting had affected our production and exports of coffee. And you'll see that in 1964 to 1970, that period, the average number of 60 kilogram bags, coffee exported in bags of 60 kilograms each. There were 2.8 million in that period. That was the average. In 71, 79, 2.7 million. So 3.5% reduction. Of course, 71, 79, this is the mini era. It was a difficult time. From 1980 to 89, there's a further reduction to 2.5 million on average per annum. And then I've put in red 1990 all the way to 2024. You'll see an increase between 1990 and 99, 20%. The 20% increase, which is quite dramatic. But during the early 2000s, I think this when we have the coffee wilt, there was a reduction in production and the average came down to 2.8 million bags. But then from 2010 onwards, we have an increase of 37.3% and now 58.9%. So this is a dramatic increase in exports. And as we are speaking now, the exportation is quite high. This is a graph showing the same figures I've just went through. So we can go on to the next graph. I attempted I was curious on the per capita coffee exports. And I think because of increase in population is much bigger than the increase apparently in coffee. So the per capita, the number of coffee exported per person on average has actually declined from around 20 bags per capita down to about 5, 6, 7 in the present era. I was just curious about that. I don't know how to interpret the significance of it. Next. Households producing coffee have increased. Some of the numbers I got on households, I wasn't sure of them, especially in 1962. So I looked at, starting in 1985, only have 0.6 million households producing coffee, and the figure now has gone to 1.8 million in 2024. So it's a considerable increase in the number of households who are benefiting from coffee production. Export values have, they were rather stable from 62 going up in the 70s. I think 1 year in 1970 went 558 million, or 558 million US dollars. But as you can see, the highest spike has come now with shooting over $1 billion for the first time at present. Next. This simply gives you a picture of the volatility in prices. The red curve is showing the extreme volatility in coffee prices. And I think the idea of a stabilization fund, which at least in colonial days was intended to stabilize prices so that coffee, whether the price went down or up, you'd continue to get a stable price. may not be a bad idea. I know when Dr. Mhumza was talking about it, he didn't think it was a good idea, but I think that as what's happening in tea industry now, for example, the tea sector has literally collapsing because of very low prices, and this volatility in prices is something we should look at. Now, how the dramatic rise in coffee production occurred, because we are supposed to be talking about Musevenomics, so we need to explain what happened. In October 2014, number one, the president issued a directive to increase coffee production to 20 million bags by 2020. This is from an average of 3 million bags over the previous 50 or 60 years. So I think I'm not surprised that the directive was issued in October 2014. I happened to be appointed as the head of the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit in 2015, and the first order I received from the Prime Minister was this directive from the President to increase coffee production to 20 million bags by 2020. When it had been copied to the Minister of Agriculture, to the Minister of Finance, to the Vice President, everybody in government had received a copy of this directive. But when I looked around, by October 2015, 1 year later, nobody had done anything about it. So the Prime Minister gave it to me. It's my unit, the delivery unit. And we wondered what to do. We consulted around, and the Coffee Development Authority at that time said before they could tell nurseries to produce more seedlings, because the directive said we should distribute free seedlings of 300 million per annum for 3 years. And when we calculated the cost, I think it came to over $40 billion, if I remember well, additional money that was needed to pay for the seedlings. The Prime Minister called the Minister of Finance, and they said they didn't have the money. So we said, but there's a directive here. He said, but we don't have the money. Having been a Minister of Finance myself, I could sympathize with them. If you don't have the money, you don't have money. So the Prime Minister called them again, second time. They said, okay, we are going to look for the money. Then we kept quiet for a week or two. Then he called them again. And they said, okay, we'll look for the money. So when I was training on service delivery, we were told that prioritization is key to service delivery. And we found that when I met the permanent secretaries, they all said their areas were priorities, each one. So we said, well, we have I don't know how many ministries. If every ministry is a priority, then there is no priority. And it was a big struggle. But eventually, I think we had learned, of course, to distinguish between strong directives from the president and directives which were not too strong. This one was a strong directive. It could not be ignored. So we started to call in stakeholders with the help of some consultants, McKinsey and Company, came in to help us. And the stakeholder consultations were held between 2015 and 2017. This was research consulting stakeholders to learn what is actually on the ground. It was not academic. It's not reading books and statistics. It was consulting people who are in the sector. And following this, we were able to construct a roadmap, a coffee roadmap, to reach 20 million bags by 2030. But when we presented it to the president, he said, no, at least make it 2025. We said, fine, we put at 2025. But in our calculations, we thought it could be done by 2030. But what I'm also hinting at here is that we involved the president in our efforts, in our prioritization and implementation. I think that one of the major lessons from this exercise is the problem of policy versus implementation. And what I'm telling you, I'm deliberately telling you this to show how we went about going from policy to implementation and why I believe that we were successful. So in addition to the coffee roadmap, once we had the roadmap on how we are going to get to 20 million bags, we also had to have real-time monitoring. For example, real-time monitoring of seedlings distribution. The initial money that we gave out for seedlings, when we followed it up, I'm afraid to say how much of it was stolen. The seedlings were presumably produced, but nobody got them. And they were paid for. About 90% of them were not delivered. Sorry, 10% were not delivered. So we had to implement real-time monitoring, bring about a process of monitoring nationwide down to LC1. So unless you had dug holes and the holes were counted and then reported and signed by LC1 and LC2 and then the report sent to the district, then that would determine how many seedlings would be distributed in that area. But without it, we would not distribute the seedlings. Lessons from the coffee roadmap of 2017. One lesson, I believe that's very important in Musevenomics, is the importance of target setting. And I think the president has done very well in this area. 20 million bags by 2020 seemed like a dream, but it's like, I think Kennedy announcing that Americans are going to go to the moon. You know, I don't think they knew how to go there, but they said we are going there. And eventually they got there. So setting targets, quantitative targets, is very important. I already mentioned prioritization, but prioritization, thank you, prioritization involving the head of state, because at other levels, the priorities tend to be ignored. 3, the stakeholders lab, as it was called, bringing together all the stakeholders in the coffee sector for 1 week at Chigo was very important for us in determining the roadmap, a realistic roadmap, and we learned the distinct. I'm a professor, but I learned the difference between speaking theoretically and speaking from people who have first-hand knowledge. People who are transporting coffee, who are processing coffee, who are growing coffee. Talking to them is different from reading books and saying, this is what is going on. So I believe that the roadmap we put together remains an important document to guide the future of the industry. Pressure for results, especially on the seedlings financing. I've already covered that, so we can go to the next. Continuing with the lessons, liberalization of price controls and exchange controls are essential to continued growth, and especially crop finance. I think that what has been done in the coffee sector would not have been possible in an environment of price controls and export controls. So I hope that this environment of freedom in prices, setting prices and so on will continue to be there. Crop finance continues to be difficult, especially those who are trying to export. It's a very, very painful and expensive process. And I think we have a long way to go, especially for Ugandans to be a significant part of this sector, because currently are dominating that sector. So I want to disagree with Mr. Muhumuza here when he said the central bank should not concern itself with credit. Mr. Nwagaba, please, I'm an exporter. We need money for export, and it's constraining us, and we are being driven out of the sector. So please find ways of helping us so that we can also continue, but not only continue, but also grow in that sector. Why should we leave it to foreigners? Ugandans also need to participate in it. Finally, a concept of structured demand. It underlies coffee expansion, because without market there will be no growth. So as a part of the roadmap, we had to do a global market research. And we were confident that it was okay to encourage the farmers to increase the coffee production, because the market for coffee was growing. We didn't want to repeat the double production campaign of Idi Amin in the 1970s. So double production, you double production, then there is no market. So we did a study of the global market, and we felt that as we increase coffee production, we don't have to worry about finding a market for the product. So that roadmap is based on this fundamental knowledge that the world market for coffee is growing. And indeed, as I speak, the prices are quite high. Thank you very much. That's what has happened in the coffee sector during President Museveni's period. There's definitely a dramatic increase in coffee production, and the number of households benefiting from it. I'm sure there's room for improvement, but there's no doubt that his targeting for 20 million bags has resulted in a dramatic increase that had not occurred in any decade since 1964. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ezra, and let's give him a bigger round of applause. I did hear from one of his neighbors thanking him for provoking so many questions, and I think I totally agree with that. We're going to switch up our program just a little bit to make some adjustments, but I'll be communicating that later on. Talking about the coffee sector, if I asked how many of us here have at least been convinced to plant some coffee in the recent past? Let me just see your hands. I think, Prof, you can see clearly, including myself, because I vested myself more, at least on the production of the seedlings end. But when you talked about seedlings, especially when you were complaining about just how much money has been lost, my bigger thinking was also about the quality of seedlings that are produced. That's one of the biggest problem. Because there is a boom, because there is markets, there is a little bit of a problem with how many nurseries are certified to produce what quality of seedlings. So while some of the nurseries will be visited by the National Coffee Research Institute, and you have all these seedlings coming through, you're being trained on what to do, there is another person who is looking at getting it the easy way. So they'll do whatever they have to do and produce whatever kind of seedlings they do and cash in on them. So while we are looking at that coffee roadmap, I think the issues of quality come in very handy, but also the issues of payment for the supplies that do come through. Because as a nursery farmer, I know that there are quite a number other nursery farmers who have also complained about that. So while I loved when Dr. Momza talked about the holistic view of looking at this entire conversation. The roadmap is ideal. It's very great. We're looking at these monies and they're definitely going to come through. But can we also start from the beginning all the way to the end? I think that is going to be a very good conversation. And in our Q&A that will be coming through, chaired by Mami, I call her Mami, Dr. Victoria Sech-Toleko, I think a lot of these conversations are going to be coming in. So ladies and gentlemen, we've been seated for quite a bit. Health is very important. I always remind ourselves. Your back is very important for you because it does have your spinal. So I'm going to allow us to do a little bit of a movement as we have our coffee break. But shortly before we go for the coffee break, because we were supposed to be having our opening ceremony and we are still just getting the two special guests on our opening ceremony ready. So we'll have our coffee break and have the opening ceremony immediately after, and then go into the session that we were also supposed to have. But just before we do that, I am going to request for our partners, I am going to request the front tables here, including our EU partners, to be able to come through. The UDF, Uganda Development Corporation, I do see the Private Sector Foundation, Uganda, as well as all our partners, to please, Professor Ezra and the entire table right there, to please come to the front so we can have a group picture, because most of this we definitely need the memories coming through. I do see the Vice Chairperson of the Uganda Development Forum, who is also the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs. I am kindly requesting that as I do get to mention all these names, Dr. Virunji, Uganda Development Corporation, let's get here. Yes, the Deputy, yes, let's get the Deputy Governor, let's get to the front and have this memory, because then we'll be able to say that as we discussed at the Musevenomics conference, these are the ideas that came up, and this is what we agreed. This is what we've been able to do. Because that's also the kind of assessment that we are having right now. That what was it before? What have we worked on? What have we tried to deal with? What has failed? Okay, not failed. What is still challenging? What is still working? That's a bigger conversation. And also much later on, we're going to continue with more and more conversations on cost of doing business. We'll be looking at conversations around value addition and industrialization. That is very, very key. So we're going to have time to exchange some pleasantries during the coffee break. So I am going to kindly allow that all our partners step forward so we can have this photo moment. I hope the stage is big enough for us to be able to. And since we have some steps, we will extend forward. So some will get to the lower steps and some will remain right up. Okay.
Okay.